Almost a year ago, I was an opener at a resort, clocking in before 5 a.m. each day. The resort is located inside of an affluent neighborhood in a very wealthy town. Employees had to park in one of the 2 parking lots at either ends of the property, and I chose the lot that was adjacent to the long and windy road outside the resort, which led to the rest of the neighborhood. The road and the resort were separated by a short range of bush and trees that no one ever really walked through. I'd arrived one morning per usual and put the car into park with my headlights still on. The lights in the lot weren't ever on in the morning since no one else really showed up before 6 a.m. when the sun was out, so it was usually always dark at the start of my walk. Save for security, I was one of the first employees to arrive on the property each morning and was usually completely alone in this particular parking lot at this time. This morning didn't really seem any different. I had my hand literally at my keys, my brain in the process to turn off my car, when I noticed a young girl, maybe like 14 or 15 years old, come scampering through the span of the trees that separates the resort from the outside road. It's like her body language was the exact definition, run with quick light steps, especially through fear or excitement. She was now directly in front of my car, and my headlights illuminated a clear view of her in the pitch black. She looked like she was in high school and had long blonde hair. She was wearing a jacket with pajamas maybe, like she had just walked outside of a house. One thing about her that bothered me though, was that she wouldn't stop laughing and smiling. I couldn't hear her laughing from outside of the car, but she was visually giggling at something I wasn't aware of or could see, and it was so unnatural. She occasionally glanced behind her, as if someone else were there waiting away from the headlights. She then waved at me like it was a normal gesture at this time, and then immediately ran to my passenger side door. This all happened in the matter of seconds, and I wasn't really sure what was even happening besides my anxiety spiking. I know that I simultaneously yanked the aux cord from my phone to shut off whatever song had been playing, while also grabbing for the lock button. I remember feeling that panic for never remembering if it's up or down to lock when the girl began pulling violently and incessantly on the door handle on the passenger side. I realized because I didn't turn my car off, it stayed locked. She began pounding on the window, and I was screaming at the top of my lungs for her to leave before pressing on my horn. I could see her laughing outside like this was some type of game, as if I were a silly friend not letting her in as a joke. After a few seconds, she stopped the pounding and tried to open my car door. Her face fell flat like I disappointed her, and she started to walk away from my car back the way she came. She waved at me again before squeezing through the trees out of the view of my headlights. This whole encounter confused me as much as it did scare me. Most people I told the story just chalk it up to her being on drugs, but that narrative hasn't ever felt right to me despite her behavior. Maybe she was just being an extremely out-of-touch teenager whose parents need a firmer grip on her. My first thought was possibly human trafficking, but I'm not so sure that I would fit well in this scenario, as I'm not the most well-versed with the subject. I told someone when I made it to the LP, but they didn't seem to care that much. I didn't call the police, and I regret that. I'll never get out of my brain, though, how fucking off the feeling was watching a stranger, seemingly alone, pop out from the trees in the darkness laughing, and then try to violently enter your car in an empty parking lot. I do think that the possibility of someone else being present the whole time is a lot more scary, and I wonder who else was there, and where exactly. I'm somebody who can lay claim to having essentially been inside a tornado. June 3rd, 1980 is a date which is burnt into the memories of Grand Island, Nebraska residents. On that day, our town of about 40,000 was hit with a slow-moving supercell complex, which produced a number of tornadoes which lingered throughout the night. If you want more details of the event, a simple search of Grand Island tornadoes will produce a number of hits that can go into the news and reporting details around it. Our town made national news. We were declared a national disaster zone, and a number of books and movies have been written or based on these events. I lived in the direct path of one of those tornadoes. I was a few days shy of my 9th birthday, and this is now nearly 40 years later, but I still remember that night vividly. My father was away from our house when the tornado sirens rang out. He had gone to play racquetball and then go out afterwards with his friends for some food, so we had no idea where he was. My mother, sister, and I, along with our dogs, stayed in the basement. We had a radio and were hearing over the radio the reports. People who grow up in this part of the US are familiar with tornadoes. They are a part of life, and tornado warnings are taken seriously. But usually nothing comes of these warnings. We go down to the basement and wait them out, and are rarely ever in the way of a direct path. Most of the time, we simply hear the next day that a barn was lost or a few homes were damaged. But this night was different. It had been a scary-looking storm from the beginning. I vividly remember walking that afternoon with a 6-year-old friend who said, "I think there are going to be tornadoes tonight." The sky just looked eerie, even at 3 in the afternoon. He was right, and hours later we were hiding in the basement. My mother had pulled the couch away from the wall in our basement, and we were huddled behind the couch, tucked between it and the cinder block basement wall, well away from any windows or potential wind tunnels. Normally, we would just sit in the basement and not worry, but she knew this was far more serious than any normal tornado. By the time the tornado hit our house, the electricity grid was already demolished, so we had no lights. Only flashlights and some batteries, and a battery-powered radio to get updates. We started hearing the tornado before it actually hit us. You could hear, even in the basement, some howling and the sounds of boards and debris being flung everywhere. We actually knew before the hit that it was there. Then the impact. It was unbelievable. Imagine standing next to the tracks of a freight train that is going 60 miles per hour. Imagine the sound of that kind of ferocity from a few inches away, so close you could reach out and touch it. That's what it sounded like. But even weirder is that reality, when in the middle of a tornado, that the pressure is rapidly and violently changing. So, on top of this furious sound of screaming freight trains, is the fact that your ears are popping at about 1 second intervals. So there's this deafening howl, and through that howl your ears are just popping. I still shake my head remembering it. Never have I experienced something like that since. From our basement hiding place, we didn't experience any significant winds. Mom had been really smart about how she placed us in the basement, but the noise alone was utterly terrifying. To be above ground and experience that, along with the actual direct force, would have been inconceivable to me. The full-on hit probably lasted much less than a minute, then it moved on. The whole time I sat there, holding onto my dog so she didn't run away. When it was done, it got eerily quiet. Then the night went on, with mixtures of rain and no rain, and us staying downstairs the entire time. After it had passed, I got out from behind the couch and laid down in my beanbag. I remember laying in that beanbag, holding onto my dog with my sister and her beanbag next to me. My mom mostly laid on the couch, but a few times ventured upstairs. I don't think I slept at all that night. If I did, it was for the slightest moments. I remember saying the next day, "This is the first time I stayed up all night." What I didn't appreciate that night, because my mom didn't want to share her terror with us, was that the radio was reporting all of the time about the most severe tornado, a monster which tore down Locust Street, a business district, and destroyed a huge swath of businesses. She knew that after my father's game, he and his friend were headed to a restaurant on Locust Street for a late dinner or snack, and she knew the timing of the tornado to know that he must have been there when it struck, in the middle of that monster. My mom went that whole night quietly certain that my father had died, but not wanting to share this with us. With no electricity and no phones, there was nothing she could do to alleviate any fears. She just had to wait and find out what happened one way or another. My father showed up sometime early morning. He had been at a restaurant when the tornadoes hit, and actually was an out-and-out hero, pulling people into a walk-in refrigeration unit just as the tornado directly hit the restaurant. He even had to tackle a panicked woman who tried to run out. He took her to the ground and forcibly pulled her back into the refrigeration unit right on impact. Our car had been totally destroyed, flipped end over end by the tornado. This had pretty much happened to all of the cars in the parking lot. The people there were all safe, but they had no ways of making it back home. I think he got a ride partway to our house from somebody and walked the rest of the way home. When we got up the next morning and walked outside, it was as if the neighborhood had been bombed. Our house was mostly standing. The authorities tried to condemn it, as the exterior wall of our garage was completely gone. But my father argued the point, and we managed to only have damage consistent with about 50% of the value of the house. Insurance covered nearly all of this. So we got new windows, new siding, new carpeting, a mostly rebuilt garage, and probably a new roof. We were the lucky ones. We spent about 2 to 3 weeks living with friends who had not been impacted, and then moved back in. Our next door neighbors on each side no longer had houses. They were leveled completely. The one house was just gone. leaving nothing standing other than the nearly brand new organ they had. Somehow every wall around it had been swept away by the winds, but the organ sat there, nearly untouched other than a chip in one key and a lot of rain damage. It was surreal. The neighbors on the other side had similar devastation. It was like the entire house had just been swept off its foundation. Looking down our street, this was almost the same story down the entire block. It appeared like the tornado had zigzagged back and forth across the street between houses. If your house was mostly standing, then it was likely that each of your next door neighbors' houses were completely gone, along with the house directly across the street from you. It was almost like a checkerboard of devastation, 50-50 odds that your house was gone, but 100% chance that your house got hit hard. Many of my friends spent the next year or more in several FEMA trailer parks dotted around the city while their homes were rebuilt. It was a very strange reality. These massive trailer parks of hundreds of identical white trailers all lined up in a grid formation. That was life for many from 1980 to 1981. Amazingly, very few people actually died. I chalk this up to the familiarity and respect that people in Tornado Alley have with tornadoes, at least in this part of the country. We take them seriously, and with this hitting in the evening, most people were home to get cover well in advance of the actual strikes. As I recall, every death from the tornado was a head shaking, "What was he thinking?" A few of them driving in cars well after the sirens had been blaring. A guy sucked out from his front room window since he didn't believe the danger was real. People with whom I share my story often marvel at it, but I've got several friends whose similar stories are just as interesting or more than mine. It's a bit weird to grow up with such a shared experience. When you and all of your close friends have lived through something like this, it impacts you, but you somewhat take it for granted. But to now be away from these friends with the shared experience, it's clear that this is really unique. Maybe less than 1 out of 1,000 people has a similar story to this. So many people that I talk to find this story amazing and fascinating, but at high school reunions, rarely does anyone talk up this experience. It's just what it was. This was our shared childhood experience. I travel alone a lot and have been super fortunate to have minimal creepy encounters, but this one still makes my spine tingle. I was in London for 6 days on a stopover on my way back to Canada from 6 weeks in South Africa. I'd been working in South Africa, very long but rewarding days, so the London stop was touristy and lazy. It was just a nice reset before I got back home to Canada. There was a pub a block or two from the hostel I was staying in that I ate at every night. It was cheap, cozy, and never too crowded, so I'd bring a book, order a pint, and eat supper. I had chatted with the waitress a couple nights in a row. She was very kind, my age, and we exchanged a few stories. She knew from chatting that I was traveling alone and staying in a hostel nearby. Well, on day 4, I followed my usual route from the hostel to the pub and greeted the waitress. She said hello and quickly brought over a drink menu. Not 30 seconds after I had sat down, a man walked in and sat a few tables away. She motioned to him and mumbled, "Do you know him?" I kind of laughed and said, "Definitely not. I don't know anyone in London." She nodded and positioned herself between myself and the man and said quietly, "He got off a bench and followed you from the street over. I don't like the look of him and I thought I'd just ask. It might be nothing, but thought I'd mention it anyway." I thanked her and said I'm sure it's just a coincidence. She shrugged and took my order, and the evening proceeded as usual. The man also ordered a drink, but no food. I stayed for over 2 hours, reading, eating, and drinking. The pub was quiet, and a few other people or groups came and went, but the man stayed. He drank the 1 pint and refused top-ups. The waitress kept a close eye on him and me and stopped over to chat several times between refills, but didn't bring him up again. When I was finishing my last drink and preparing to leave, I glanced over at him and noticed he looked on the edge of his seat, like he was preparing to leave too. I hadn't really thought much of it until then, but my stomach suddenly knotted up. It was dark and drizzly, and I had a short but lonesome walk back to my hostel. I suddenly felt distinctly unsafe. I summoned the waitress over to pay and asked her if she'd mind calling me a taxi as well. She nodded vigorously, and I knew she thought this was a good idea. The taxi showed up. I thanked the waitress and left. I hopped in the taxi, and I swear that old man thought I was so dumb for needing a drive for such a short distance, but whatever. I felt so much safer. I went back the next evening as it would be my last night in London, and I wanted to say goodbye. I wanted to thank the waitress for her hospitality, friendship, and ultimately looking out for me. When I arrived, she ran over and said she was so glad I'd called that cab. I guess right after I left, that man left too, seemingly really agitated. He'd not even asked for a bill, just left money on the table and stormed out. She felt very confident that he had seen me walking alone, followed me in, and was planning to, quote, approach me when I left. What would have happened then, neither her nor I really wanted to think about. I had a lovely last night at the pub, and we even shared some small glasses of wine together for a quick cheers before I left. I don't walk places alone at night anymore, even if it is just a short distance. It all started when 4 people unknown to me knocked on my door. I went outside to talk, and they asked if they knew where my daughter's boyfriend was, as he had hurt the daughter of the mother who was asking. I said I didn't know, and I didn't think he would do something like that, and I politely suggested that they take the matter to the police. This did not please them, and I was rushed at first by the mother. I put my hand out to keep her at arm's length away, but then 2 others came around each side. After many punches to the head, there was no more time to roll with the punches, as another would come from the other side. I experienced a warm, sleepy feeling, and came to face down, still receiving hits. I decided to roll over and do the so-called Chihuahua move, blocking the biggest hits from metal poles aimed at my head, my forearm, leg, any way that I could. Also, I screamed out for help, hoping neighbors would hear and act. In fact, 2 of them did call 000, the Australian emergency number, before I could. I decided that I had to get up and was thrown almost through a timber handrail. I fought falling through as I was worried about being on the ground a meter below. Somehow I got past one of them standing in front of my front door, then I ran inside and locked the door. At this point, I reached into my pocket to retrieve my phone to call 000, but before that happened, I saw a pole come through a window. Then the door was kicked in. My thought at this point was if I do nothing, I'm dead. If I fight, the best way I could hope for was being found in time to wake up in a hospital in a bad way. Next thing I remember was hitting the first 3 heads that came through the door, then blank until I was trading furious punches with 2 in front of me, and a third came rushing to the right with a charging baseball-style hit with a meter pole to my temple. I decided to turn my head a bit and got hit on my right ear. I then stepped my right foot forward and connected my right fist to his left cheek. Then there was one who was right in front of me. I thrust my left fist with a hard follow-through, the only time in my life that I did not hold back. I connected to the center of their face and saw the person stumble back. I then moved hard on my right foot and thrust my right fist into the left cheek of the next guy on my left, who stumbled into my TV. At this point, I am stunned that they had backed off, and very surreal that I'm alive, standing and talking. The main offender screams at me to get my daughter's boyfriend, or my daughter to her, so I pretended to agree. I pulled the phone out of my pocket and called my daughter. When she answered, I warned her of the people looking for her and her boyfriend. Also, I asked very seriously what she knows that I don't. At this point, I picked up my work phone and rang 000. I couldn't talk as I was too busy. I aimed the microphone at the offenders making demands at me, so I could provide evidence. I then saw them walking away with 2 of them helping each other walk. Minutes or moments later, the unit caretaker said police were on the way, and then they showed up along with an ambulance a couple minutes later. I can't remember which was first. I went to the hospital, had several x-rays, and luckily nothing was broken. I had a hematoma on my ear that was drained and stitched, and I had soft tissue injuries for 2 years, memory issues, and counseling, but I'm all good now. I also found out that I broke the main offender's nose, and there was a lot of blood on the floor behind where I was standing in my lounge room while taking on the 2 on in front of me. I assume because of the bruising on the back of my head that I did a reverse headbutt on one of them who dropped a metal pole, not sure though. The police team cleaned up every drop of blood for DNA evidence and identified 3 of them who received suspended sentences or a good behavior bond. 1 got away due to lack of evidence though. Police said I used self-defense and reasonable force. I had to clean up all the glass, and insurance paid over $4,000 due to building damage. I don't even remember getting hit on the back, and I didn't notice any of my facial injuries until my daughter called me puffy face. The bruising on my back was only hours old in this picture, and got much larger with all sorts of colors over the next few days. The first night, I was up having to pee almost every hour whilst my body was eliminating bruising toxins. It's quite amazing to not know the extent of one's injuries due to adrenaline, I guess, and I didn't notice some until weeks later. I was backpacking my way through Asia in the early 2000s and spent quite a bit of time in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Island is pretty hilly to say the least. I found myself near a fancy hotel, I can't remember which hotel exactly, that was on a higher plane than where I wanted to go and didn't see an easy way to get down. I spotted an entrance to a set of stairs that I thought could exit to the street below. These weren't outdoor stairs, they led underground in retrospect, probably the fire exit for the hotel. The door was unlocked and I just went in. Each floor had a door that I assumed led into the hotel or would exit to the street. I found each one was locked. I probably should have just left as soon as I saw the first one was locked, but I was young and dumb and thought that eventually there would be a door that led out to the street below. So I kept going down this extremely dark stairwell, trying to open each door. When I finally reached the bottom, I noticed a bunch of shapes in the darkness, mostly rags and boxes. Then I noticed the movement. There were maybe 5 or 6 men down there all sprawled out, not talking or anything, but they noticed me and at least one was staring at me, the whites of his eyes reflecting what little bit of light was down there. They were definitely high. I can only assume I had barged my way into some sort of heroin den. I just sort of stood there looking at them, and they were looking at me, no one saying anything. I slowly backed up out of their sight and then rushed all the way back up, maybe 5 floors or so. Maybe it's not too creepy compared to other stories, but I was definitely freaked out for a while. It was totally dark and no one knew I was down there. Of course, maybe they were equally freaked out that someone had barged into their secret spot. I was out jogging with my sister-in-law over the summer. The sky was a bit gray and it was incredibly hot, but it didn't look particularly bad. I did think that it was a bit odd that the parking lot near the trail was empty though, as it usually was pretty full. We take a trail through the woods at Lake Elkhorn. The heat was horrible, and the fact that we were jogging through a swamp on raised wooden platforms along Little Patuxent River doesn't help. Finishing our jog out into the middle of the woods, we turn around to walk back, incredibly relieved to feel a sudden cool breeze, soaked with sweat and exhausted. We come into a clearing, and then we see the sky, which is utterly black and boiling. We stare for a moment, look at each other in silent oh shit mode, and then run to underneath the nearest shelter, a concrete highway bridge. A few other people stranded by the sudden storm join us. Sure enough, buckets of rain followed by quarter-sized hail starts to drop and the winds pick up. Lightning is hitting the ground every minute or so all around us. I see it hit one mammoth sycamore about 1,000 feet away. We later had to climb over it to get out of the woods. It literally shattered into hundreds of pieces and fell onto the path. The trunk of the tree was about 4 feet in diameter. It had to have been at least 150 years old. The after images from the lightning strike blinded me for a while. I just happened to be looking right at it when the lightning struck. Both the best and worst part was when a confirmed tornado passed right over our heads. Thankfully, it didn't touch down for another couple miles, but it was still powerful. All of a sudden, everything got quiet, and then I saw what was literally a wall of wind coming straight at us. Trees bent over sideways and leaves and dirt came flying right at us, and I only had enough time to turn my face away to keep the dust out of my eyes before it hit. I didn't even have time to brace myself. On the way out of the woods after the storm, we climbed over at least 4 large trees down right across the path, and innumerable branches. Both my sister-in-law and I got hideous cases of poison ivy from climbing over all those trees. It was both amazing and beautiful. I didn't panic at all during the storm. It was so awe-inspiring that there was no room to feel fear, even when that wall of wind was flying straight at us. But afterwards, once we had to climb over a few trees that would have killed us if we had been near them, I started to panic. I couldn't help but worry, what if my sister-in-law and I had decided to try and make it back to the car before the storm hit, instead of hiding under the bridge? But I would do it again if I had the chance, even with all the poison ivy. This story kind of creeped me out. It happened about 9 years ago and sometimes comes to my mind. So I was on an adult dating site, One of the fetish types. I know, don't judge me. I was just looking for some fun. Anyway, I was stupid and gave out more information than I should have. I was chatting with a guy, and he asked me at some point what I did for work. At the time, I was working at McDonald's, so I told him. He asked which one, and I stupidly told him which one. I also stupidly gave him my phone number at some point. We chatted off and on, and we hadn't been chatting for too long. He would talk to me about how he wanted to meet me on break and have some fun. I told him no thanks. I don't bring my lifestyle to my job. Anyway, so I checked my messages just before I was due to clock out of work. Luckily I did. He mentioned that he was at my job and told me what he ordered. I think it was a Big Mac meal. I was like, okay, well, don't expect me to do anything with you. I'm not interested. He then got upset and wasn't accepting that I wasn't interested. I was also scared because I had sent him a face picture of myself, but I had never received one from him. I really wasn't too interested in him, so I decided I didn't need a face picture since I wasn't likely going to meet up with him. His interests weren't what I was looking for, and I have a hard time straight up saying I'm not interested, just slowly started to ghost whoever I had no interest in. Now, luckily, I hadn't told him my work schedule, so he didn't know I was about to clock out. So, after I was finished at work, I told one of my managers that I was on a dating site and some guy just showed up to my work and I have no idea what he looks like and that I was going to hang out in the back of the break room for a bit. Luckily, she didn't judge me and was just like, oh, okay. So I waited for about half an hour before I left. I didn't have a car at the time and had to walk home and was afraid he would see me and try to pick me up in his car. Luckily, no one followed me, so I was in the clear. So, creepy guy, let's never meet. I don't think he ever messaged me again, or I ended up blocking him or something. I don't really know if it's all that creepy, but it does creep me out that some random person just decided that he would show up at my job and expect me to want to meet up with him. So yeah, now I just give vague responses as to where I work now. I don't work in the same town I live in, so it would be hard to pinpoint my exact location. This opened my eyes and made me more aware of the information I give out to strangers. In 2016, I hiked from New Jersey to Virginia on the Appalachian Trail. I was on the part of the trail known as the roller coaster not far from Harper's Ferry. I hit heavy rain, and the trail became a stream, and all of my rain gear decided to give out. Everything I had was soaked. I had to spend the next day waiting for my gear to dry out at the nearest shelter. Around noon, I can see someone walking intersecting to the trail. I can tell he's not a hiker, being he had no bag and was wearing jeans. He told me his name was Steve. He was asking me if I knew a Chris or a Jim. Being that no one uses regular names on the trail, there would be no way to identify them even if they were real people. Steve said he had walked from DC about 80 miles and was told to meet Chris and Jim for further instructions. He said he had information, and the NSA was after him. I figured that the guy was having a mental break or something and felt sorry that I couldn't help him. Not too far off was a free hiker hostel, maybe about a 4-hour walk. The hostel was just a shelter that was enclosed with a wood-burning stove, but next to it was a house that a ridge runner, someone who does trail maintenance, lived at. I directed him towards that. After all my stuff had dried, I headed to a hostel and got there early evening. As I'm walking up, I can see the ridge runner and Steve arguing. The ridge runner is yelling at Steve, telling him to take a trail to a road to leave this area. If he did not, the ridge runner would call the police for trespassing. At the shelter, I saw familiar people who filled me in on what had happened. At every shelter is a trail log. The log is a journal that keeps track of people who pass through and notes about what's happening on the trail. It's also a way to pass messages to people you might know behind you. Steve got a hold of the log and started looking for a message for him. He thought he had to decode the messages to find instructions for him. Steve started to write random things and crossing things out through the log. This action pissed off people who were already wary of Steve because of appearance of not looking like a fellow hiker. Steve also argued with a few people before this and made a fire to burn some paper he was carrying. They notified the ridge runner. People were pretty upset about Steve, so I never told them that I ran into him previously. I never saw Steve again and still think that he was a person with mental health issues having an episode. However, I do imagine the scenario where he was telling the truth and what his story was. I personally was not, but it was in my parents' house and the house I'm living in now. It was during the day and we have a back window that is just a bit too close to the ground. The windows are all newish, but a window lock only does so much. A few people decided to break into our house through this window. They came in and stole what they could, which was not a ton of stuff, but enough. They stole our mom's jewelry, our Wii, some cash that was for emergencies, and a few other random things, including a change jar. We have ornate iron doors on both of our front doors, and while trying to get out, they grabbed every key that they could find, but still had to go out through the back window again. Those door keys are on our keychains that we kept on our person. Luckily, nothing was damaged or vandalized, and our dog, who was pushing 10 at the time, was also safe. We're actually not sure how they got past him, but they did, and he was okay. My mom came home first after feeling like something was wrong in her day. They left the door ajar because they couldn't get out. My mom grabbed the dog after seeing this and went to the neighbors. The police believed that they rushed out the back door after seeing my mom's car turn the corner. They ended up being tweakers, so thank God she didn't walk in on them. Not everything was recovered, but they were arrested eventually and all served time. We now have a security system that we're all hypervigilant about, and there are bars like the security doors we have on the windows that they got through. I think the worst thing that happened was what was taken from my mother. She lost a lot of trust in the world. Both of my parents were raised in this town and have seen it go from 5,000 to 30,000, and it's jaded her quite a bit. She also lost her sense of attachment to this house, which is also unfortunate. My parents have never had huge incomes, but this house was their first, and both my sister and I were raised in it. It was purchased directly after I was born, but now they can't wait to get rid of it. I had a stalker for over 10 years. This happened in the late 90s. I, Catherine, and my friend Rose met him together. My stalker was a guy Rose and I met on a bus one day coming home from my volunteer work after school. We were on the bus going home, laughing and talking as normal, and this guy just randomly sits by us and starts talking. He tells us his name and we laugh, thinking he said his name was Gay. Yeah, stupid teenage girls. He corrected us and said his name was Jay. We talked a bit more and innocently gave him our names, and he asked for our number, but I said no. He was like 7 years older and kinda strange the more we talked to him. He got annoyed, but whatever, right? So we thought that was that. A few days, maybe a week later, me and my same friend run into Jay while switching buses downtown. I was going to her house like I did a few times a week when we run into him. He asked for me to hang out and watch him play hockey that night. I said no, I was going to my friend's. He got weirdly annoyed and kept trying and badgering me, telling me about how much fun it would be and trying to get me away from my friend. He really didn't want her to come to this hockey game either, just wanted it to be us, me and him. So weird. Our bus finally came and we got out of there fast. Over the next few weeks I kept running into him downtown. It was like he knew my schedule, and every time I tried to be nice but get away as fast as I could, and every time he would get annoyed because I wouldn't hang out. A few weeks pass, and I'm in school, and in walks Jay. I was so mad and frustrated that I snapped on him. Why was he here and how did he know what school I went to? Did he follow me on the city bus? He tried saying that he was there to see his friends, but he wasn't with anyone. Just like some 25-year-old guy wandering around a high school? I doubt it. After that, I would randomly see him on my bus, and he would always try to sit across from me and watch. He would still ask for us to hang out, and I would still say no. As time went on, he would still find me on the bus and sit across from me with who I guessed was his girlfriend, or some girl he was trying to make me jealous with. He would look at me while making out with her. He would do everything he could to make me feel uncomfortable. I would either turn up my music and do my best to ignore him, or move to another spot. Nothing ever seemed to deter him, though. He never did anything bad to call the police, but he knew it was wrong, and he knew it bothered me, and he knew I would have a panic attack, and I'm sure he got off on that. As the years went on, I would see less and less of him. He would randomly pop up and make me uncomfortable. He started standing really close to me and trying to talk. I would have a panic attack and do my best to ignore him. I would still walk away and would just get more pushy. Every time I would run into him, I would text my friend that was there when we first ran into him and get her to calm me down. It's now 2023, so 24-ish years since this all started, and I haven't seen him in at least maybe 8+ years, and I'm just praying that I never have to see him again. I'm 43 now, so he must be going on 50, but I'm still scared to run into him. I had thought that I had seen him a few times and panicked, but it ended up not being him. I just hope I never have to see him again. While driving from California to Mississippi, we got caught in a huge desert storm somewhere in Arizona, or possibly New Mexico, I can't remember. There was a lot of rain and wind, but it started off normally enough. After about 5 minutes though, it started getting crazy. The dirt and sand was so dry that all of the water coming down was kicking it up more than soaking it. So after a few minutes, both sides of the road were completely hidden by dust going up about 30 feet, and then above us was just rain, with the freeway cutting through it. It looked like Moses parting the sea, except it was a freeway parting a giant dust cloud. So that was kind of neat, but then it got really intense. Every time lightning flashed, you could see into the dust clouds, and there were multiple tornadoes or dust devils on each side of us. Deciding to take shelter, we pulled into a motel that was ahead of us and ran into the lobby along with about 4 other people who had come off the road. Just as we were getting into the lobby, the storm really took off, and we started getting hail too. One guy actually slipped in the parking lot and started bleeding everywhere, and me and my husband had to dash outside to literally drag him into the building. Then us, the guy, the others from the road, and about 6 people from the hotel, including the staff, just huddled in the lobby watching the security camera feed from outside on the desk computer. One by one, the cameras were getting taken out by hail or wind, until eventually it was all just static and dust outside the windows. This was like something from a disaster movie, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. When I was 17, I had a boyfriend who was in the army. We didn't live on base, but in a tiny neighboring town nearby. He had some beef with a skinhead gang who had some members that were also in the army. One night, while we were sleeping, they knocked on our door. It was about 2 a.m., and we had no peephole or window near the door, so I opened it with the chain on. As soon as I did, 5 guys rushed the door and broke the chain. They all had baseball bats. The lights in the living room only stayed on for about 10 seconds because they began smashing my lamps, the overhead light on the fan, and the kitchen and bedroom lights with their bats. I've never almost pissed my pants until then. I was so scared and my legs turned to rubber. Strangely, after they broke the chain, but before they smashed the lights, my vision got really dark, like the lights were dimming down. This was the first time it ever happened, but to this day, if something startles me, my vision goes almost black before snapping back to normal. So, these guys grab my boyfriend and are holding him down on the couch. 2 guys holding him down while the others take swings at his torso with their bats. I have no clue what to do, so I try to tackle them by taking a running jump. It's not really effective. I'm 17 and short, and these guys are like 25 and huge. My feet are bloody and cut up from running through broken glass, and I'm only wearing a t-shirt and underwear. We had 1 phone in that house, and it was in the bedroom, and I somehow felt like these guys weren't going to let me at it. I ended up running out of the house with no shoes, bloody feet, and glass digging in deeper every step. I looked for the town's only cop. This is in Nolanville, Texas, with a population of only about 2,000. I ended up at the post office a few blocks over. There's a payphone, so I tried calling 911. It rang and I was immediately put on hold. While I was waiting, the cop found me. He handcuffed me and put me in the cruiser because I didn't have any pants on. I tried to explain that my house had been broken into and my boyfriend was being assaulted, but the cop insisted on running my social security number to make sure everything, quote, added up. While I was in the back of the police car, I see the 5 guys drive past us in a pickup truck. After everything checked out okay with my record, the cop drove me home, blowing off my break-in story completely. My door was wide open, only the porch light lit, and my boyfriend was still on the couch, curled up in a ball. He declined to go to the hospital. We later found out that he had 2 broken ribs. The cop called a backup unit from another neighboring town and then urged us to name the attackers, but my boyfriend wouldn't. We've never been fond of local law enforcement. Not much ever came of it, except I have a little PTSD from it, and we bought a shotgun to keep beside the front door from then on. Traveling in South America by myself as a 22-year-old woman. I arrived in Santiago, Chile by bus really late at night, like around 10 p.m. Shortly after I got off the bus, a guy comes up to me from the general area of the taxi stand and asks if I need a cab ride. I say yes. We start walking to his cab and it's really far away, like at least 5 blocks. I start to feel kind of uneasy, but I'm also in the middle of this big, unfamiliar city and just try to reassure myself that it's fine. I double check that his cab has all the normal brand markings when we finally get to it, and sit up front with my bag. That was more out of habit, as it's common to do this in Ubers in South America. I give him the address of the hostel I booked, and we small talk in Spanish for a few minutes of the ride. And then there's a bit of an unnatural pause, which he breaks by looking over at me and saying very calmly, "Are you scared?" Of course that really freaked me out, but I just tried to stay calm. I just laugh a bit and say, no, I'm good, just tired and it's late. And he goes, well, you seemed pretty scared back there when we were walking. You know, there's a lot of bad people around here. Sometimes they pretend to be taxis. You never know who to trust. I've heard of women being sold after taking a bad taxi. Are you traveling here alone? He said that all while we were still driving through the middle of the city. It's dark and it's late, and now I'm painfully aware literally no one knows where I am. I was going to message my family with an update when I got to the hostel. They don't know I'm in Santiago. They think I'm still on the coast. Of course I don't say that and tell them that I'm always very careful, and actually my group of friends know I'm on the way and are waiting for me at the hostel. I see a stoplight coming up and was literally thinking that as soon as the car slowed down, I was going to make a break for it and just jump out of the car. Probably the most scared I've ever been in my life. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see this guy reaching down for something under his seat, and my brain just goes, gun, 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 it's going to be a gun. Instead, he pulls out a pamphlet, and then he goes, but you know, there's always one thing we can trust, right? The Lord. Do you believe in God? And then proceeded to try and convert me for the remainder of the ride. It turned out to be harmless, but in the moment that random religious cab driver scared the absolute shit out of me. I lived in Moore, Oklahoma. Yes, that Moore, Oklahoma. I was 13, I think, when a twister came uncomfortably close to me. The black clouds of the thunderstorm turned a lovely spring day into total darkness within minutes. The violent rain began pounding in sheets. Wind battered the storm doors. I thought for a minute that someone was knocking. The rain worsened. I looked out the storm window in my bedroom, and it looked as if someone was spraying it with a garden hose. On the television in the living room was famed meteorologist Gary England reporting that the tornado watch was now a tornado warning, meaning that we had gone from conditions being good to create a tornado to, guess what, a tornado is actually staring right at you. Then came his speech. All y'all get to your storm shelters. If you don't got a storm shelter, gather your family into the room central to your house, maybe a bathroom. Get your loved ones into a tub. Y'all be safe out there and God bless. Damn, Gary was good. For a second, I actually believed that he genuinely cared for the safety and well-being of every one of his viewers. And then the horns started. Those damn horns. Every Saturday at noon, they would wail those air raid sirens to make sure they functioned. This was not Saturday at noon, and the sound of the sirens meant something much, much worse. If you can hear the sirens, you're in the possible path of a tornado that has currently touched down and is fucking up the lives of a lot of people. The sound of those air raid sirens still give me a panic attack when I hear them. Mom and Dad get a call from the neighbor saying his storm shelter has more than enough room for all of us, so we are rushed to the mudroom and suited up in our rain boots and slickers. Dad unlocks the storm door and opens it up, but the wind rips it from his grasp and slams it open, nearly shattering it. We are corralled over to our neighbor's backyard, where he is waving us to rush into the shelter so he can button it up. I look around at the terrifying storm surrounding us. The wind is ferocious. It was tearing at the leaves in the trees and sending whole branches soaring through the air like they were floating down a stream. The cloud cover above us doesn't look right, though. The shapes and patterns are unlike anything I'd seen in a normal thunderstorm. It was as if they were rolling. My observations are interrupted by my mother yanking my arm towards the shelter entrance. It's buried deep underground. The stairs leading down to the underground shelter are menacing and foreboding. I sit on a bench in the shelter, surrounded by a handful of neighbors huddling around a transistor radio tuned into the weather station. Our neighbor is having difficulty closing the storm hatch to the shelter, and water is pouring in. He is cursing, so my dad jumps up to help him force it closed. I remember it being eerie in the concrete underground sarcophagus. You can hear a muted soundtrack of the thunderstorm raging above, though. The wind begins to scream like a tea kettle boiling on a stove. I leaned against the cold concrete walls of the shelter and can feel an ever so faint rumbling, like as if a freight train is passing nearby. Then came an immense crashing sound. The neighbor curses and says it's probably the aluminum shed in his backyard collapsing. Time begins to slow to a crawl, and it feels as if we are in the shelter for days. The smaller children begin to get fussy and cry, and the adults are holding hands and praying. After what had to be hours, an inaudible cracking came over the radio, and the adults prepare to exit the storm shelter to have a look. The neighbor and my dad are both cursing and forcing the storm hatch open, but apparently the neighbor's shed had collapsed and debris were blocking the exit. The hatch is blunt forced open, and we eventually get the okay to exit the shelter, and I exit to a war zone. Every shingle on roofs are sheared off. Most of the trees are either uprooted or snapped in two. Anything that wasn't firmly affixed to the solid foundation is now gone somewhere else. We were 2 miles away from the F5 tornado that touched down. We were extremely lucky. When I was about 9 or 10, I was invited to a classmate's birthday party at some swimming baths. All of us were about the same age. It was a small class of about 20 kids, and I'm pretty sure everyone was invited. Just to clarify, I'm a boy. Anyway, I kind of got separated from everyone, and it was just me and this girl alone. I wasn't particularly close friends with her, but I did know her as she was in my class. To describe the location we were in, it was in a tunnel that connected the main wave pool to a lazy river. There wasn't really anybody else there, just me and her, when suddenly she lunged at me without warning. She grabbed my head and held it under water. I was a pretty skinny kid, and she was bigger than me and a bit of a tomboy. As about 20 seconds went by, I continued to furiously try and kick myself free, but she wasn't letting go. Fight or flight and mass panic took over, and I eventually fought my way free. I was coughing and spluttering water as I emerged. I remembered looking at her and being just in shock. I think I began to ask why she did that when she lunged at me again. She again held my head underwater for what felt like a lifetime before I finally fought my way free again. Both times I genuinely thought I was going to drown, and she didn't let up. I had to fight my way free. I couldn't swim at this time, but the water in the lazy river and tunnel was just about chest high. I began to backpedal away from her. She was giggling as if she thought it was funny, and had this kind of crazed look and grin on her face. I couldn't just climb out to escape, as it was a tunnel, so I had to try and get out of there. As I was backpedaling, she was following me, and I made sure to keep my distance so she didn't lunge again, but she was gaining on me. I actually managed to reason with her as I was so scared of her, I was babbling at her. I tried to distract her by suggesting we go down a water slide together. It worked, as I could see her thinking about it, and she stopped chasing me. I managed to exit the tunnel in water, and she slowly followed me but seemed a bit unsure. I immediately felt more safe as I was out of the water and could see other people about as we headed towards the slides. I kept talking all the way up about how fun the slides were, etc., but she didn't really speak at all and had this really strange look on her face the full time. Anyway, after we went down the slides, I caught up with my friends and just stuck with them the rest of the time as I was a bit shook up. I never told the parents or my friends about it, as I was a bit embarrassed to admit a girl had tried to drown me and was worried I'd get teased. Anyway, fast forward to adulthood, this girl turned out to be a lesbian. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but she got with her partner who had 2 or 3 kids from her previous relationship with a guy. It turns out that they would torture the kids together, and eventually they killed one of them. She is currently serving a life sentence in prison. I told my friends about the swimming pool incident after hearing about her crimes, and I'm pretty sure they think I was just bullshitting, as none of them took me seriously. Maybe it was because I kind of lightheartedly said I was almost her victim number 1. However, nonetheless, it is a bit crazy to think back, as she obviously was a genuine psychopath, and if I had never fought her off of me to try and escape, and then convinced her to go down the slide, I genuinely believe that she could have killed me. My mom had recently been making a lot of brownies. On this day, she made a particular batch that was greater than any of the brownies she had ever made before. We ate a few, but for some reason didn't finish them, and we left them out on the kitchen stove. My mom, my sister, and I all went to sleep later that night while my dad was out at a meeting. My mom, knowing my dad would be home in just a few minutes, didn't think she needed to lock the doors before she went to sleep. Now, we're all asleep and my dad pulls into the driveway. The very first thing that he notices is that our garage door is open, and his bike is standing outside. Then he turns and looks into the house. Standing in our kitchen is a man. My dad doesn't realize what's going on. At first, he assumes that one of his friends had come over, wanted to borrow his bike, but was waiting for him to come home so he could ask him. Then, the man inside our house sprints out the back door. My dad starts to chase him, but stops, He knows we're inside and he wants to make sure that we're all okay first. So now, we're all gathered downstairs and we notice something. The intruder walked into our house, and the first thing he would have seen is the kitchen table. On the kitchen table were 3 wallets, all untouched. Then we look over and see the plate of brownies, completely destroyed. The man who had broken into our house skipped over all the valuables and went straight for the brownies. At that time, I was more disappointed by the fact that we didn't get to finish the brownies than scared that we had been kind of robbed. Obviously, my mom and dad were pretty freaked out, and they bought an alarm system for the house. My dad didn't sleep for a few days, but other than that, the only thing we lost were some really good brownies. I was driving from Georgia to California to visit a friend. I didn't want to fly because I wanted to sightsee on the way. The hotel I booked on Expedia screamed run from the get-go, but I was exhausted and wanted to rest. I got my room key and checked in. I locked the door, and because I'm always on guard, I locked the bar on the door for extra safety. About 4 a.m., I was sleeping and heard someone trying to come into my room. They had opened the door but couldn't get past the little bar that was locked. I quickly got up, threw my clothes on, and went to the door to see what was going on. 2 guys outside the door with their hand on the slit of the door yelling at me. They kept saying, "Come here, pretty girl," "Oh, a pretty face," or something like that. I called the front desk to see what was going on, and they said, "Oh, I didn't know that you were still here." I was beyond furious and went to the front desk with all of my stuff. The lady at the desk said I didn't have a reservation even though I had my papers saying I was checked in. I had my car decal stickers for parking there, and the room key. She said that she rented the room out that I was in for the next month. Flabbergasted, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She looked up my information and said, "Oh, I see, you didn't book with us, but through Expedia. We don't partner with them." Still confused as to why in the world I was given a room, paid for it, and had issues being in it. She refused to call her manager at 5 a.m. by that point, so I waited until they got in at 9 a.m., demanded a refund, got it, and checked out. No matter how terrifying the ordeal seemed, I think it would have ended differently had I not locked the bar on the door. The super outbreak of April 3rd to 4th, 1974 remains one of the most outstanding severe convective weather episodes of record in the continental United States. I was almost 14 and we had a small horse farm just to the north and east of Xenia, Ohio. We lived in a brick post-Civil War era farmhouse, white painted board fencing around the house, 8 stalls, 2-story Amish built barn, and divided 20 acres in the back, same board fencing. My mother kept me home that day, and I remembered just wanting to get on my horse and ride, but Mom said she had a funny feeling and wanted me to stick close to home. So I ended up helping her with a few chores, fed the animals, and by the afternoon, I was sitting on a big grassy lawn to the side of the house tossing a ball to my dog. It was oppressively hot and humid and very still. I remember Mom kept coming out onto the back porch and looking off to the west. She was making me nervous, but I didn't say anything, and neither did she. Later, I learned that she didn't want to scare me. As I was sitting there in the grass with my dog, I remembered that this shockingly cold little gust of air kind of swirled around me, lifting the little hairs on my arms with goosebumps. When I looked at my arm, I realized that the light had changed. I looked around in sort of wonder because the light was so clarified and vibrant, sort of a greenish amber in color. The blades of grass and leaves on the trees looked stunningly brilliant. As I was looking at this big maple tree, a sudden cold air swirl hit hard enough that the leaves on one side of the tree all turned up. 2 things happened at that moment. My mom came outside, and to the southwest we both saw a wall of dark greenish-black clouds. Then everything happened at once. She said, "Come with me and put the horses out, quick." So we ran to the barn and turned the horses out. Then she had me gallop my Appy to the back gate and open it so they were basically just free. I galloped back to her and released him after removing his halter. Then we ran back to the house. At some point or another, she had opened the outside cellar doors, and I was able to call my dog to me as we ran down the cellar stairs. When I got into the cellar, I realized that she had prepared while I was outside playing. There were pillows, blankets, flashlights, milk jugs full of drinking water, and a cooler with snack food all tucked into the corner. This was kind of amazing to me as we didn't have any tornado warnings, and there were no sirens anywhere around Xenia at the time. But people in my family seem to have great instincts, so maybe I wasn't as surprised as some would be. I was looking out the high cellar window, through which you could see the outside, up out the old window well. I saw it coming up through the back field. It was almost as wide at the base as it was at the top, and black as coal. It was twisting and hopping, so to speak. By that time, it was so damn loud that we couldn't hear each other even screaming. I knew it was going to hit the barn, and it did. Thankfully, it did one of those hops, so it just removed half of the roof. But by then, my mother and I were kind of wrapped around each other with blankets and pillows surrounding us. Regardless of that, I ended up with splinters of wood in my scalp, face, and upper arms from where the cellar windows sucked out and wood from the barn, along with a bunch of other chewed up pieces and God knows what, came into the cellar. I even had mud and sawdust splinters in my mouth, piercing my tongue. I should have just kept that shut, but I couldn't help but scream until the air got sucked out of my lungs and I couldn't breathe for a while, let alone scream. I couldn't have heard it by then anyway. After a point, my ears felt like there were railroad spikes jammed into them. What was actually breathing was the house. I remember a flash of seeing the ceiling, which would be a kitchen floor kind of bowing upwards, bulging up. As it turned out, the kitchen floor lost most of the tiles, silverware, dishes, etc., but our hand towels were still hanging on the little cupboard door rack. Mom just ended up throwing them away anyway, because of the mud and other unmentionable things we found in the house afterward. We lost all of our windows and part of the roof, part of the 100-year-old barn roof, and some fencing, but we were still alive. We had a trench dug through parts of our fields, and some trees were completely knocked over, and some things, like horse tack and tools, were gone forever, never to be found. So, eventually I went to the hospital. Someone came to check in on us and took us there, and I got plucked, as I will forever refer it to. Ever see a video of a dog getting porcupine quills removed? Not quite that bad, but worse was getting iodine scrubbed to prevent gas pocket infection from where the splinters and abrasions were. I had abrasions on my legs, but I really have no idea how. You see, after a tornado has been down for a while, it has killed animals and people most likely, and the remainders of that and manure and ground up asphalt, and you name it, it's all mixed in. It can generate a pretty hellish infection. But anyway, I didn't feel so bad knowing my mother was getting the same treatment in the next cubby. And the horses ended up being okay, but the chickens weren't. But I still can't walk into a lumber yard or eat with a wooden spoon without feeling like I'm gagging. Okay, so bear with me. This happened when I was a kid and I double-checked the story with my family. So, this was in the mid-80s. I was about 7 at home with 2 of my older sisters, 8 and 11, and 2 cousins, 7 and 8-ish, all 5 girls. My sister, the 11-year-old, was in charge of babysitting us 4 younger girls. You have to picture what our house looked like to understand what happened. It was a 2-story box house with a flat roof and a small box front porch, also with a flat roof. I can't remember what we were doing, but we were all in the house. We kept hearing noises coming from the roof, like walking, and what sounded like rocks being dropped down the drain spouts. You know kids, we thought of a squirrel or something, but it kept happening. Then my older sister said something about how maybe someone climbed the huge tree beside the house and got onto the roof. We all ended up being scared because of what she said, and we knew that there was some roof access point in the bedroom that I shared with one of my sisters. What if he could get inside? My oldest sister told my other sister and one of our cousins to walk across the street to the corner store, across an empty gravel parking lot, and on the way back, look up and if they could see someone on the roof. So the girls walk halfway across the parking lot and being curious kids turned around, looked up and saw a guy in one of those totally 80s guys crop top football jerseys. Think like Johnny Depp in A Nightmare on Elm Street. He was crouched down on the roof. The girls came running home freaking out and told my older sister about the guy. My older sister, now freaking out too, first went to the neighbor's house to use their deck to see if she could see on the roof, but she couldn't see anything. She came home and then called the police. It felt like it took them ages to show up. When they got there, I don't think they believed a word we said. They thought a bunch of little kids are making up this story for attention. One cop drove down the road, up a hill about a block away to see if they could see anything, but the way the roof was, you couldn't see a person if they were laying. Then the cops tell us kids that we had to go upstairs and check everywhere to see if we found anyone. 5 little girls from the ages 7 to 11 sent upstairs, scared shitless, crying to look for this man, knowing about the roof access, and all crying not wanting to go, but they said we had to. To this day, I remembered how scared I was. I remember looking, but how well do little kids look, right? The cops didn't listen to us, didn't check out the house, inside or out, and just left. We were so scared to be left home with the guy out there, who knows where. We didn't know if he was just laying down on the roof or jumped down or somehow got in and was hiding. My mom finally got home a few hours later, and we told her what happened, and my mom explained to us that there was a lock on the roof access and no one could get in, but she checked anyways. Then went to check outside. There were clear footprints in the dirt, dug in good from him jumping off, onto the porch and off into the lower flower bed. Oh, my mom was so steaming mad when she realized we told the truth and weren't believed by the police. We went to the police station the next day and we were all separated and interviewed. We all told the same story. My mom went up on one side of the cops and down the other. We never found out who the guy was or why he was there. Did he know it was a house with 5 little girls home alone? Probably. I was 18 and it was my first time traveling alone. I went to Argentina for 3 months. My first weekend, and I'm wandering around Buenos Aires. At the time I knew enough Spanish to get by, and a man approaches me and asks me for directions in Spanish. I tell him that I'm not from here. He then asks if I'm a tourist. I say yes, and he seems delighted, quickly telling me that he is too. He offers up the idea to explore the city together. I, alone in the big city, agree. We start walking together, and he seems like a really nice guy. After about an hour, he says, "Tengo hambre," which means I'm hungry. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and it's about 1, so we go out to a nice restaurant. He tells me I have to try the steaks and red wine. I'm not much of a wine fan, but he convinces me. We're there for about an hour, and the bill comes. It's 140 pesos. He pulls out 100 pesos. I try to pay for my half, but he only lets me pay 40 pesos. He tells me I can get the beers later. We continue on our little adventure and eventually come to a bar with outdoor seating. The waitress brings out a liter of beer, and we relax. Soon enough, another liter of beer comes out. We finish the second liter and leave the bar. And all of a sudden I wake up 8 hours later, missing my debit card, iPod, cell phone, and travel guide. I had just moved into my first apartment and was in the process of actually moving in. The door that led into my apartment locks itself automatically when closed. So I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail while talking on the phone with my boyfriend. I returned to my apartment and sat on my bed while opening the mail while using the phone. I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under the bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye though. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still with his back towards me and his head to his chest so he couldn't see his face. I don't think he was able to see me either. Trying to be rational while so many thoughts rushed through my head, I picked up my phone, said, "Sorry, I dropped my phone. I'm just gonna go take a shower and call you back." The bathroom was right next to my bed, so I hastily walked in. I quietly locked the door, turned the shower on, and jumped out of my window. My apartment was on the first floor. And then I proceeded to call the police. They told me to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anyone comes out of the door to the apartment complex. This was during summer and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car while watching my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my boyfriend and he came to me just before the police did. I gave them my keys and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops come out holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that had stood beside me and comforted me while the police searched through my house told me that the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives waiting for me to come out. I was just a mess, shivering and crying. This man had somehow crept into my entry door while I was getting my mail and hid under my bed. The man that was trying to hurt me turned out to be a homeless person and was placed in a mental hospital. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day. Not creepy in the sense that I was scared, but creepy in the sense that I wanted this motherfucker to get away from me. I was taking a red-eye from Miami to Buenos Aires. It's a pretty long flight. Like an idiot, I thought that a middle seat at the front of the plane would be more desirable than a window or aisle seat at the back of the plane. It wasn't. So there I was, in the middle seat of the plane with older gentlemen on both sides of me. The unspoken rules of the airplane are as follows. The aisle seat can extend their leg into the aisle, the window seat can lean against the side of the plane, and the middle seat gets both armrests. Those are the rules. I've been traveling for work for a long time, and those are just the rules. The guy in the window seat must not have known the rules because he kept trying to push my arm off his armrest. I fought him for a little while, but eventually let him have the armrest and just tried to get some sleep. Things neither escalated nor de-escalated until about 30 minutes after we had taken off. A foul stench reached my nose, and I couldn't immediately identify its source. I briefly inspected my surroundings and discovered that my window seat neighbor had removed his shoes. Exposed and naked to the world, his greasy toes wiggled and shamelessly exuded an aroma that was a mix of sulfur, sausage gravy, and mold. To my absolute shock, he lifted his foot nearest me, slid it out from the space under the seat in front of him, and placed it in the adjacent space under the seat in front of me, the space my feet were actively occupying. In the following moments, I realized I had a decision to make as to the severity of the conflict I would instigate. I had immediately decided that conflict would be unavoidable, with the brashness of my rude neighbor's most recent offense. There was a scale of following actions that I could have taken. I could have nudged his leg and treated the scenario like an honest mistake, which it was not. I could have gone straight to yelling, which would have been most uncomfortable in the early stages of a red-eye flight. I opted for a multi-step approach. First, I, quote, accidentally stepped on his toes with my heel. He responded to this by pulling his leg up, clearly looking to readjust and place it back near where it was. I caught his knee as he pulled his leg up and firmly guided it back to the space he was allotted. No eye contact was made, but he grunted in displeasure of my actions. In anticipation of a retort, I remained ready to defend what little territory this American Airlines flight had loaned me for the evening. As in most scenarios regarding any scale of conflict, my heart beat quickly and my adrenaline surged for triple, maybe even quadruple, the amount of time the situation actually took place. After the incident, he appeared to abandon his invasion and spent the remainder of the flight impersonating a hibernating grizzly bear with sleep apnea. Between the adrenaline that remained in my system and his unnaturally loud, throaty snores, very little sleep was had. Fuck that guy. This happened years ago when I was barely 14. My middle school and the middle school of my best friend at the time organized a trip abroad to Great Britain, London to be exact. It was supposed to be a few days looking at London attractions, museums, and shops. It was fun, until it wasn't. For the day we were supposed to leave and go home, we were brought to some streets with some interesting shops, and we received free time for shopping. Then, our teachers and guide had a brilliant idea. They told us that after the time for shopping ends, we have to meet at a different street than this. In retrospect, it was only 100 meters away, but they still shouldn't do something like that. Most of us have never been to London. We barely speak English, we don't have a map to the city, roaming services don't work correctly. It was just a bad idea. 90% of the students got lost. I got lost with my best friend because we went in a complete opposite direction. We were both confused about the directions we were given. We were walking along pavement and my friend was running ahead, and I was staying behind, too nervous to look around. We didn't look like we were together, because we were not interacting with each other. I guess that's why this happened. Like I said, my friend ran ahead and stopped to look around when I saw a black car approach me and match my speed. I started to feel like this was a scene from a movie. It was broad daylight and there was a lot of people around and no one reacted. I was confused and didn't know what was happening. Then from a car stepped a man and said, "You're nice, come with me," and then tried to grab me. The car was still running, so I suppose someone was still in it. I was stunned. I did not believe it was real. At that moment, my friend ran to me from behind, grabbed me and dragged me away. We ran and tried to lose tail of the man or the car because it followed us. After some time, we stopped and my friend nervously cried, shaking me and screaming why I didn't move when the man tried to catch me. I explained my deer in headlights moment. We cooled down and managed to ask some people for help, and we finally were found by our teachers. We didn't tell anyone what had happened, as we were sure no one would believe us. After that, when we got back, I told my parents, and I never went on a trip organized by that school again. My mom considered all of that really unprofessional and irresponsible. This story takes place in 1977. The cast of characters includes my mom, my dad, my brother, and of course, the serial killer. My brother was little at the time. He had been at a friend's house. I don't remember what the occasion was, but my parents were picking him up. It was late at night, winter. My parents picked up my brother, loaded him in the car, and start driving home. As they are leaving the neighborhood to get to the main road, they see a man come out of the woods with a shotgun and get into his van on the side of the road. Now, the area I grew up in was suburban, but the folks can be rather redneck. Seeing someone come out of the woods with a shotgun is worrisome, but usually just means it was a poacher. My dad just keeps driving. The man gets into his car and follows my parents onto the main road. Still, nothing to really be worried about. They make a few turns on their way home, and it becomes increasingly obvious that the van was following them. They pull into the housing plan we lived in, which was mostly new construction. The van pulls into the plan behind them. At the time, our house was the only finished, occupied house on our little cul-de-sac. The street lights hadn't even been turned on yet. It was pitch black, winter, cold, and isolated. The van pulls into our driveway behind my dad. My dad gets out of the car, sends my mom and brother into the house, and tells them to lock the door. He waits till they get inside, and then he walks up to the van. He stands at the nose of the car and just stares at the man inside. Waits. No questions, no bravado, no nothing. He just stands there and waits, intimidatingly. Now, what you need to know about my father at the time. He had a full-ride scholarship for football in college. Dropped out and decided that it would be fun to join the military and volunteered to go to Vietnam because he was quote-unquote bored. He spent a year on some godforsaken little island at a ranger camp. He is an intimidating man and always has been. Without being overly tall or large, he has a presence. You just don't want to fuck with him. He's now much older and somewhat overweight, but in 1977 he must have been something, because without any words being exchanged, the man put his van into reverse and just drove away. The story doesn't end there, though. The next morning it was all over the news. A man had been murdered the night before, in the housing plan my parents picked my brother up from, just a street away. A man had been shot through his living room window with a shotgun. He died on the floor while his wife tried to flee, and the kids were asleep upstairs. The wife leads the man through the woods on a chase, and they find her body a few hours later in the woods, the same area where my family saw the man come out. It turns out that it was Edward Surratt, the serial killer. I was an exchange student in China around 2000, and with a fellow buddy I was exploring Xi'an. Our hotel was on a very big 6 lanes brightly lit street with half the people foreigners. At about 10 p.m., me and my mate decided to go out and find something to eat. At an intersection, we found a smallish shop, bought a snack and asked around with super limited Chinese and English, and found someone who spoke English, the quote niece of the shop owner. She was super young, but spoke good English and said that she could direct us to a very good and cheap restaurant. So we agreed, and she leads us just down the street and into the non-tourist part of the city. It was interesting how the surroundings changed. After a few minutes, we were the only foreigners on the street, and a lot of people were staring at us. The buildings became more run down, and the place wasn't very brightly lit, but it was still charming. She kept talking to us, asking us questions, where we stayed, how long we stayed, what our plans were, etc. She also mentions a few times that she was studying and 21 years of age. This raised a few alarms with me, but me and my mate didn't want to be rude, and we were really hungry. After about 15 minutes, we arrived at a very small and somewhat charming restaurant. I don't know the proper name for this kind of shop, but in China, at least the cities that I visited, there were a lot of shops in prefabricated houses. Each house had 2 smallest shops on the street level, and you could see all sorts of businesses in these, some of the bigger ones renting 2 adjoining ones to form a bigger shop, etc. The restaurant was in one such half-size store. There was just 4 tables, 1 counter to the kitchen, and in the back there was 1 video game machine. With the help of our translator, we ordered and then she excused herself. The food was really good and cheap. We both got a super large bowl of ramen, a heaping dish of different baozi dumplings, and several beverages for no more than 25 to 30 bucks. So far so good, but what really made the situation strange was several other factors. For one, the other guests in the restaurants looked like straight out of a crime flick, and they were talking about us, pointing and laughing. One had a bad knife scar on his cheek, the other one a broken nose, and a third one, I kid you not, an eye patch. While we ate, we saw a lot of people gawking at us, but especially noticed something like gangsters. There were 4 youngsters with matching leather jackets and short cropped hair who patrolled the street at least 4 times while we stayed there and always looked straight at us while they passed the shop. After we ate and paid, all of a sudden our 21-year-old translator turned up again, inquired if the food was good, and offered to take us to some very good place with a lot of fun. We declined and thanked her, but said that we would just return as we were tired. She fast-talked us and told us about a party, beautiful women, young girls, etc., but when we saw the younger gangsters again, we waited 1 minute and then just bailed out of there. She followed us and seemed very frustrated and even panicky that we left so suddenly. She tried her best to convince us to follow her offer, but we got out of there ASAP. In high-speed mode, we made it back to that big 6-laned main road and said goodbye to her. That whole situation was actually super scary. In hindsight, they were probably all just very nice, hard-working people who had just never seen foreigners in this part of the city. But those youngster gangers, those cliché pirates at the other table, and the shady way how that girl tried to goad us into God knows where, multiple times stating that she was 21 years of age, all of this together just led me to the conclusion that we got out of there just in time. My husband and I were driving home from an out-of-state trip a few years ago, in late March, around the start of tornado season. We stopped in Joplin, Missouri to get dinner before finishing the last few hours of our drive into Oklahoma, and I caught a glimpse of the television. It was a weather forecast showing a pretty nasty storm system a couple of 100 miles away. It looked bad, but it also appeared that it would just miss us if we left right then and stayed on the turnpike. There's a zone between Missouri and Tulsa, Oklahoma where there's like no exits anywhere to get off for gas or anything like that. The storm ahead of us looked pretty bad, and we knew we needed to turn off, but there were literally no exits. Lightning struck the side of the road as we passed by, and that's when I realized we were in trouble. After a little while of staring at a storm wall cloud, my phone started buzzing that there was a tornado warning in our area. I showed my husband, and not 5 seconds later a funnel cloud started forming in front of us, not a mile up the highway. Finally, a fucking exit showed up, and we swerved through it, as this appeared to be a rather large tornado that touched down. Not sure how big, we pulled into the gas station and ran inside with a bunch of strangers. Then the power went out. I called my mom and told her what was happening and that I loved her. I was 100% sure I was about to be in serious pain. At the last second, this big-ass tornado turned away and destroyed a few houses, I believe. I can't remember if anyone ended up dying, although I believe that there were a few casualties. We got back in the car and drove home, and it was one of the scariest moments in my life. I went to a big city in Colombia, and the hostel had a rooftop hangout spot. I'm a man from the USA. People left one by one until it was just me and a girl from Europe. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I last remember checking. She was quite friendly, and the conversation was very surface-level casual, asking about the best restaurants in town or something like that. Now, I was not drunk or doing drugs. I only had 2 light beers, they were less than 3%, in about 2.5 hours. But the next thing I remember from the night was waking up in the early morning hours in a hotel hallway bathroom shower with a jacket on now. The lights were completely out, and I struggled to gather my senses as I crawled around utterly confused in pitch blackness until I felt a toilet and realized I was in a bathroom. It was my jacket, by the way, but it was previously in a suitcase in my room. I then went back to my room, shared with 3 other people by creaky wood bunk beds, to sleep more after that. The next day, when I asked, nobody noticed anything strange about my night. They all slept soundly the whole night, which is also strange given I apparently came in inebriated to some degree, got a jacket out of a suitcase on the top bunk, left, then came back. I honestly didn't bring it up to the girl ever, because I truly don't believe she was the cause of anything. We both saw each other plenty after that around the hostel for another week. She was genuinely a kind person. I didn't feel physically hurt whatsoever, and nothing of mine was stolen. I had a smartphone and about $150 cash in my pocket. I've never gotten an explanation for the night though, and I've never been aware of any sleepwalking habit. When I was younger, I lived on an estate of houses that backed onto a huge field where many people walked their dogs. It was even used as a cut-through to the next neighborhood, which would take approximately 25 minutes to walk through. When I was about 13, my neighbor and I decided to camp out for the night in my back garden, which apart from a 6-foot wooden fence was completely open to the field, albeit with 20 trees around the fence. Seeing as we were into Action Man figures at the time, we decided we would make the tent a hideout. So we get together some branches and one of those army nets to put over the tent to make it seem a bit stealthier. We also put the tent in the corner of the back garden, which had a small roof over it, which made it very dark once the sun went down. We did the usual thing, ate loads of crisps and sweets before we decided to try to get some sleep in our well-hidden super dark tent. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone landing and then walking on small stones. I then realized that sound was coming from below the fence where my mom and dad had decorated with some gravel and flower pots. At first, I thought it was our cat, but it was far too loud to be such a small animal. I slowly sat up, trying not to make too much noise from my sleeping bag. Then I heard it again. I once again tried to make my way to the front of the tent silently and looked through the zipper. About 10 feet away from us, there were 2 guys dressed in all black, crouching under the windowsill of the kitchen talking to each other. I immediately froze and had no idea what to do. They proceeded to creep closer to us, looking for some more windows or maybe an entrance. Because we were in the corner of the garden, we were quite close to the path that led down the side of our house where there was a door into the adjoined garage. I heard them talking quite clearly now as they were less than 5 feet away from me and my friend who was still asleep. They were talking about being unseen and just taking whatever they could find in the garage instead of breaking into the house and disturbing anyone. I had no idea what to do, so I rang the house phone, which was pretty loud, and waited for someone to answer. It took a while for anyone to answer since it was very early in the morning. As soon as the phone rang, the 2 people bolted to the fence and hopped over. My dad then answered and I whispered for him to get outside as soon as possible with a bat or something. Nothing happened in the end, but I am glad that my friend slept silently. I was living in Huntsville, Alabama during the April 27, 2011 tornado outbreak. I remembered that bad weather had been expected that day, but I wasn't really prepared for when the tornado sirens started going off that morning around 6 a.m. I had a bad feeling. They had said the worst was to come later that day. Sirens early, before the daytime heating, gave things a chance to get nasty, which was worrisome. Power went off that afternoon, but we were fortunate enough to be able to watch the radar for where the worst was up until then. Large tornadoes missed us just to the north and south. There were rumors that the nuclear power plant at Browns Ferry, about half an hour away, had been hit by a tornado, flew around after the power went out. That was sort of true. The auxiliary power lines into the station were damaged, and they had to perform an emergency shutdown. Several heavy storms with straight-line winds and lightning came through that day, each time worried it might contain another F5. I didn't sleep well that night, even though the worst had passed. The day afterward, we started learning how bad the damage was, and they were estimating up to a couple of weeks without power in some areas. I ended up staying in a hotel in Atlanta for a few days. I had been planning to go there anyway to escape after finals, just pulled the reservation up a week. At the airport when I landed, a cab came up and offered me a reasonable fare. I was loading my stuff in the car when an airport worker came over to me and warned me not to get in that cab because he will not take me to my hotel. I was like, what? She helped me get my stuff and told him she was watching him and he isn't getting another one. I asked her to explain. She was like, he kidnaps tourists, and that was it. She smiled and told me to call Lyft. A few days later, I ran into another dude at a farmer's market. This dude would not leave me alone. He followed me from booth to booth. He followed me to the beach, back to my hotel. He kept trying to talk to me and flirt. I was like, I'm fine, I just want to get some stuff, see you around. I was talking to a hotel worker because I made friends, and she asked me if I frequently traveled alone. I told her yeah, mostly because of the last-minute deals. At the time, I was a student, so I had a lot more time plus discount programs. He was hovering, listening to this. I went back to the farmer's market while she went back to work because another guest had come up. I was trying to stay in a very public area, starting to get nervous. This taffy vendor saw me and saw what was happening and called me over. He told me about all of the flavors he had. Creepy stalker dude came over and asked me if I wanted to go for a walk. He says, "It's nice. My hotel has a very nice view and you should come check it out. I have some friends who would like to meet you." I said no, please leave me alone, and Taffy Man, my hero, was like, "You're ruining my sale, go away." The guy eventually backed off, but was still lingering out of earshot. Taffy Guy had called me over solely to get that guy to go away and didn't expect me to buy any taffy. He said he wanted to make sure that I was safe, and if I wanted to try some I could, but he would let me know when the coast was clear. So I hung with the Taffy Guy for like an hour, and he told me it was safe. I bought like 8 bags and thanked him. When going to drop off the taffy at my room, lo and behold, my stalker had found me. I ran for it, locked the door, and waited for another hour or maybe 2 hours before I left my room and went to a restaurant and stayed there. I called my hotel for help, and they had someone escort me around. Going home, I again called Lyft. While I'm waiting outside my hotel for my Lyft, guess who is there? Stalker Man with the creepy cab guy. I run inside, find a hotel worker, tell her what's what. She calls my Lyft and tells them to a different spot so I can get out of there without being killed. Luckily I lived. I'm here to tell this story now. Shout out to her and the very, very cute Taffy Guy. I've changed some small details here and used a throwaway because I don't want this to ever get traced back to me. When this took place, I was a female in my 20s and was finishing my degree in the city, working as a casual receptionist at a firm. One of the employees, Nick, told me one day that one of his clients, who he said was a stand-up guy, thought I was very cute and wanted to see if I would be okay to give him my number. We went to dinner and he was charming enough. He was in the medical field and was about 7 years older, but I didn't mind as my own parents had a similar age gap between them. We talked about my studies and he told me that he thought my rather run-of-the-mill family life was amazing because his life was so different. He was adopted as a baby and his father was abusive. When he was 15, his mother left and he never saw her again after that. He was kicked out at 18 and ended up in a terrible car accident in his early 20s. For a long time, he stayed at a relative's house and worked to support himself. Yeah, heavy conversation on the first date, but all I felt was this overwhelming compassion for this poor human who had been through so much. He seemed nice, was smart, handsome, and though he was just a touch too serious, given his life, I figured that was understandable. We ended up dating, but by about the 3rd week, things started to feel a bit weird. He refused to introduce me to any of his friends because his last ex had left him for a friend. He also hated that I had male friends because of the same reason, and he would insist on reading any of the text I received or sent to them. I made excuses in my head for him like, people need to heal, or sometimes they need a crutch before they learn to trust again, or, well, it's not like I have anything to hide. He started being critical of the way I spoke or acted and dressed. He was also super insistent we moved in together, but I felt that it was way too soon. In arguments, sometimes, he would get a weird look in his eye, and that made me feel unsettled. And I once tried to break the tension by half joking, "You look like you want to hit me." To which he responded, "I wouldn't bother if it came to that, I would just kill you." I was so shocked I didn't even react to that until days later. Recounting it, red flags everywhere, but though it might have been hard to believe, I was actually convinced I was falling in love with him. Most of the time he was perfect, until he wasn't. But he would explain that was only because he had so many issues from his past, and I would believe him. Then one day, I told him what I thought was a funny story about a random guy in class who asked for my number. This guy had asked under the guise of getting notes for class he'd missed, but I only offered my college email address, explaining that I had a boyfriend. Hilariously, as soon as the class ended, I saw this guy annoyedly throwing the paper I wrote my email on in the bin on his way out of the lecture hall. I expected my boyfriend to laugh, but he ended up losing it. He accused me of leading the guy on, accused me of wanting to cheat. I was furious because I knew I had done nothing wrong. When he angrily threw a mug at the wall, which shattered, the whole argument came to an abrupt halt. I was scared and angry, so I grabbed my bag and bolted out of his apartment. I thought he would stop me, but he didn't. I went home and cried about it to my cousin, who I was living with, and assumed it was over. Days pass and I hear nothing from him, and within those days I started questioning everything. Suddenly, it was clear as day that this relationship was toxic and very unhealthy. Even if he did have a tough past, it wasn't my job to fix it, and it wasn't an excuse for the way he treated me. I was starting to accept that this was just a horrible near miss and get over it when he texted me again. Groveling apologies and how much he missed me, and I made the mistake of responding. He called and I picked up, but it was because I wanted to tell him I still thought it wasn't going to work out. He cried, yelled at me, asked me how I could do this to him when I knew that everyone he loved in his life had abandoned him before, and how could I do the same? He told me he would never be able to love again and that it was all my fault. I had broken him. He told me that he had given me everything, but I was leaving over such a small argument. Then he apologized and told me he was trying to change and to give him another chance. I was bawling my eyes out. I felt like the worst human in the world, but I held tight to saying that it was best we moved on and that I was sorry. He ended the call by telling me that I had ruined his life. Nothing happened for a while, except for text here and there where he would apologize, tell me he missed me, explain that he had realized that he made so many mistakes, etc., etc. I would tell my cousin about him, and she would firmly tell me not to respond. She was sure it would stop eventually. One day I finished my work as usual and headed to the station. It was a busy day and the streets were scattered with other people. As I walked, I had a weird urge to turn and look behind me, and when I did, I saw my ex. There was a little distance between me and him, but when I saw him, our eyes locked. He looked different, a bit out of it, and I thought maybe he was drunk. I decided that I would deal with him at the train station, as it was always crowded, and I wanted to talk to him only in a place where there were lots of people. I figured the yelling and crying would not be as intense that way. When I reached the station, I stopped and waited for him to catch up to me. He stopped about 2 feet away, and I expected him to start apologizing again. But he said nothing. He just stared at me. Awkward seconds pass and pass, and I said, "Look." But that's all I got out because his arm moved slightly as he took his hand half out of his pocket, and I saw he was holding a very small knife. I froze and vaguely remembered thinking that I wanted to run, but it was like my brain and body shut down. I can only describe it as if there was a fog in my brain, and I just couldn't move for what felt like ages. I just stared at him, and I still remember how his eyes just looked so blank. I don't know how long that lasted, but then without saying anything, he turned and left. Nobody else had noticed. I remember numbly getting on the train. I started second-guessing that it even happened. Hindsight tells me I was in shock. As soon as I got home, though, I burst into tears. My cousin calmed me down and helped me call the police. In the end, the security cameras weren't placed in a spot that they could clearly show that he had a weapon, so the police couldn't do much. Thankfully, I didn't see my ex again. I ended up quitting my job, changing my number, and eventually moved away to another city. To my ex, let's never ever meet again. Actually, to the guy who asked for my number in class, thank you. You might have saved my life, and definitely changed it. My parents used to have a friend from high school who they have since told me they all thought was a little strange. We'll call him Rick. My mom said that he was a really nice guy, not red flag weird, just a bit odd. They had vague knowledge of abuse in his family, but at the time, abuse wasn't something people really talked about. It was considered, quote, personal family business, so I guess they just chalked his oddness up to childhood trauma or something. Their group of friends were all pretty close, enough so that it wasn't weird when Rick would show up at our house just to hang out. My mom told me that sometimes if my dad wasn't home when he stopped by, he would just hang out with her and little baby me until he got back. The year they all graduated high school, a woman attending the university in our city went missing, and about a month later her body was found. The police reported that the woman's body had probably been there a couple of weeks by the time it was found. Her killer was never caught. A few years later, when I was a month old, another female student of the university went missing. Our local police department still has her case open because she was never found. She was pronounced dead after being missing for about 10 years, at the request of her family. Around the time that she had gone missing, I think there began to be some suspicions surrounding Rick with their social circle. No actual evidence that he may have been involved or anything, just more of a feeling they got that something was going on with him, and they just found it was a bit eerie seeing how it was at the same time this woman was missing. He had previously asked my dad if he could store a truck topper in the barn, and my mom told me that she once went to look around out there just to be sure there wasn't anything weird. She wasn't looking for anything specific, but she just felt the need to inspect the area. She didn't find anything strange or out of place, though. 18 months after that, a third woman was abducted. After being taken to a house in a tiny town outside of a city and chained to a bed, she was then taken to the bridge over the river, hands and possibly feet still bound, and thrown in. She somehow swam to the riverbank and was able to call the police. She identified her abductor to the police along with the house she was taken to. It was Rick. The police went to his house to arrest him, and as they were climbing the stairs, he shot and killed himself. During the investigation into the 2 prior disappearances, they discovered that he had taken off a week of work during the times that each of the 2 women had gone missing. Solo female traveler here who's done my fair share of world travel. I was in Athens a couple years ago and went to go read in a park. I'd been traveling for about 3 months at the time and had just gotten off a massive trek in a different country and came to Greece to relax and enjoy. I had been a few times before, so no need to go to all the historical sites in a rush. A day in the park in the sun sounded perfect. Anyway, I was getting settled into a bench and got my book out to read. About a half hour later, I get that feeling that someone is watching me. I look up and see an older guy, maybe about 55 to 65, standing about 20 yards away just staring at me. He was like half in the foliage too. There was also a little hill, so I couldn't see his full figure, just his face and upper chest through all the trees. He looked pretty harmless, but I did think it was weird, so I got up and cut through the park to head back to my hostel. He ended up following me. I assumed he didn't mean to follow me, per se, that this was just an awkward but innocent thing, kinda like when you say goodbye to someone too soon and then you still walk in the same direction with them a few feet more. I rationalized and assumed that he too had to leave the park at the exact same time as myself in the same direction. I was wrong. I take a turn to lose him that I now note was a bad idea. This took me to a more secluded part of the park. He ends up following me again. Now I notice he's really staring at me. I pick up my pace, but I don't start running because generally I've learned showing fear just makes things so much worse. I also break off a stick from a tree just in case he gets closer so I can have a very lame weapon. At this point he's still about 10 yards away and always kind of hidden behind a bush. And then that's when I notice that the guy's got his hand down his pants. This guy followed me around the park for probably 10 minutes, jacking off before I finally found a crowded area and sat down next to a bunch of women and later joined a tour group. It's not super terrifying, but just the weird image of him staring at me and perving on me kinda gives me the creeps to this day. Wichita Falls, Texas in 1979. Me, a 5-year-old, and an 18-month-old baby. We had been under warnings off and on all day, and I had placed the mattress in the hall. At 6 p.m., hell literally broke loose and the sirens sounded. I tossed my baby on the floor and covered her with my body, and laid my boy at my side and hung onto him, pulling the mattress down to cover. I looked out my window at the neighbors on their roof. My ears popped, and I heard explosions from the end of the block. All of the doors violently slammed shut. The neighbors screamed and scurried from their roof. My face was inches from the baseboards, and I watched them rise and fall repeatedly. I heard the loudest train ever. I don't know if I lost consciousness, but I definitely lost time. I rolled over and looked up to see the blackest tail of the cloud. It looked evil. I was no longer in the hall, but my baby was still with me. My boy was gone. I was in a hole surrounded by debris. I couldn't scream, I couldn't speak. I just started throwing debris everywhere, searching for my son. I was panicked and crying and screaming his name, at least I think I did. I ended up finding him underneath the rubble. He had come within inches of being decapitated by the hall door, and he was crying. He was accusatory. "Mommy, I called and called for you, and you wouldn't come." We ended up crawling from what used to be our home into a scene from a sci-fi horror film. The area was completely devastated. No house stood for blocks. Men were pacing the streets with loaded rifles. I was in shock and petrified. If someone crossed my path, I turned to follow, like an automatron. Someone took us to a surviving house across town for safety. Somehow my husband located us that night, and we went to my parents. There were no lights for miles. Nothing but darkness and miles of ambulance lights, as far as I could see. For years after, every time the sirens sounded, I melted to a hysterical puddle on the floor. Luckily, my children don't remember any of it. After a recent trek through Nepal, I decided to fly to Dhaka, Bangladesh. Bangladesh Airlines was offering a sweet deal, and I had to leave Nepal anyway due to my expiring visa. So, on a whim, I bought the tickets and went there solo. Of course, the night before, my travel buddies and I decided to have one final night out. And of course, after a few too many beers, we ended up in some shady places with shady food and drink. Waking up the next morning, the day of my flight, I immediately knew something was off. I could feel it deep in my stomach. It wasn't the kind of food poisoning you throw up right after eating. I sat in the hostel, waiting for my taxi and waiting to vomit. I knew it was coming, the nausea almost completely overwhelming. I managed to keep it together until finally arriving at the airport. I started throwing up in the unair-conditioned waiting room next to a dude having the same problem but with the other end. I threw up 3 times before even boarding the plane. So I finally get on the plane and manage to hold it down until after takeoff, when the seatbelt sign finally switches off. Once it did, I threw off my seatbelt and half ran, half waddled to the back of the plane. Naturally, both were occupied. Being the incredible problem solver that I am, I snatched a vomit bag from one of the nearby seats and began the music of fucking misery. I'm halfway filling up this poor piece of paper when the entire bottom falls out. Like the entire bottom half of this bag became so disgusted with its content, it had to reject them completely. I now have vomit drenching my clothes. A plain white t-shirt was a poor choice. The flight attendants finally see the catastrophe taking place and start banging on the bathroom doors, where some poor soul emerges confused. After my business was finally done, and with my clothes now ruined, I shamefully slunk back to my seat. When I finally arrive in Dhaka, I walk up to the counter to get my visa on arrival. Even though I consider myself a pretty savvy traveler in terms of research, nothing I had read up to that point mentioned an exit flight requirement for a visa. So the officer asked for my exit flight information, and I'm doing my best to keep my shit together. Internally, I have no fucking clue what to do. Thankfully, the airport's free Wi-Fi was available, so I hopped online to book a random flight to get me through this gate. In my anxiety of this flight, the fact that I was sick was completely lost on me. I just forgot. So I'm sitting there at the counter, and I feel a deep rumble in my stomach. I'm thinking, yeah, this'll be a great fart, and let the baby blow. It wasn't a fart. I just shat my pants at a visa desk in fucking Bangladesh, with a customs officer looking me in the face. I can feel the slow, warm trickle moving down my legs. It was literal shame in physical form. Either understanding I was unwell, or perhaps smelling the situation, the visa officer mercifully provided me a visa. I spent the next week in Dhaka, Bangladesh, shitting and vomiting my brains out, and burnt that pair of underwear forever. I lost 10 pounds that week, eating Pringles and drinking water while watching the Airbender movie rerun over and over again. It's a fucking terrible movie, but it was on the only English channel available. This encounter happened to a friend and coworker of mine about 15 years ago in a suburb of Los Angeles, California. My friend, I'll call her Jody, lived with her parents and older brother in a house in a pretty nice neighborhood, and they didn't really worry about crime, break-ins, or anything like that. One night, though, at about 2 a.m., Jody was awoken by a loud knocking at the front door. She jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway, where her parents and brother were coming out of their own rooms. The knocking, now pounding, continued. "Stay here," said her father, and made his way toward the door. All of a sudden, there came a muffled male voice shouting, "Help me! Help me!" Jody and her mom grabbed each other in fear, and her dad looked out the peephole. "There's nobody there," he said. He looked out of the front window, where you could see part of the front door and porch. He still didn't see anyone, though. He walked back toward his family, when the loud knocking began again, this time even more frantic. Again a voice shouted, "Help! Help me!" Jody's dad went to the phone and called 911, and while he was talking to the operator, her brother had walked up to the front of the house. The pounding was still going on, getting faster and faster until it was constant banging. "Help me! Help me! Oh God, help me!" Jody, in tears of fright by now, looked over at her brother, who was standing in the family room, which was located to the left of the front door. His face was white, and he made an arm gesture for them to join him. Jody, her mom, and her dad, who was off the phone with the police by now, hurried into the family room, where they immediately realized why her brother's face had gone pale. The pounding and shouting was coming from underneath the family room floor. The police arrived minutes later, and it turned out that some guy in his 20s had gotten all out of his mind that night on crack and had somehow made his way into the opening of the crawl space under the house. It was located underneath the family room window. They never found out exactly what his intention was, but they assumed he was trying to find a way into the house to rob it, but then he got disoriented because he was so high and freaked out, hence the pounding and shouting. I was in a tornado that at times reached EF3 intensity. About a mile away from my house, the fairly new fire station was unharmed, except that it was lifted off the foundation and moved a couple of inches. It had to be demolished anyway. My house was in a nice little tree-lined neighborhood on a corner lot. Now, I'm a real weather nerd and was always fascinated with weather. This particular day, though, I was very busy with work. I was working from home and was sitting in my recliner pounding away at my laptop, and my father was watching some basic cable channel. So, we were totally surprised when my sister called in a panic to check in on us. She said the Weather Channel said a tornado is hitting you currently. I said we were okay, as if it was all well, said a quick goodbye, and quickly flipped on the local news. Sure enough, the meteorologist was showing a zoomed-in map showing our little neighborhood about to be hit. I said to my dad, time to go to the master bathroom, as it was the most central room with no outside walls. So we rushed in there with the dog. My dad sat on the toilet, and I sat on the edge of the tub. We had the door open with the news on the bedroom TV, and I could see out the window. The power went out about a minute after we got in there, and so we were just watching outside. It went from looking like a bright afternoon to looking dark and stormy to a much darker, greenish-hued light outside, like late dusk but with angry green light. The still trees started suddenly being really whipped by the wind, and I just shut the door. The wind was strong for a short time, and it was absolutely roaring. I'd say like a loud, gigantic vacuum cleaner more than a locomotive. We could hear a lot of small debris hitting the windows and roof. Then, the bathroom ceiling exhaust fan was going full speed, even though the power was out. The air was rushing out of the house because of the rapid pressure drop outside. It couldn't have been more than a minute, probably less, but that moment felt a lot longer. Still, we hadn't even had time to get afraid. It was suddenly very quiet. We sat there a minute to be sure, and I was relieved none of my 5 giant trees crashed through the roof. But based on the sounds, we figured it had come close but mostly missed us. I was expecting some damage. A couple shingles missing, maybe. Maybe some dents in the siding or a tree limb on the cars. So my dad goes to the front door and I go to the back door. We both go out, and I'm pretty sure we both said, "Holy shit, come check this out," at the same time. That was our sentiment, if not exact words. Turns out that many homes in the neighborhood had the siding stripped from 1 or 2 sides of the house, large portions of shingles missing. Across the street, a giant tree was down, next door roof and siding damage. Indeed, neighbors on all sides of me had damage. The house behind us had a gas leak. The owner was actually calling out and asking for help with it, so my dad grabbed some tools and went over and got the gas to shut off. The ground was coated in twigs and shredded leaves. Shredded leaves were also stuck to the house. The only damage I had was a twig jammed up under a single shingle, and the flagpole on my front porch was snapped off the base. I learned later that the tornado had had about a 40 to 50-ish mile path, and varied in intensity along the track from EF0 to EF3. It tore the roof off a big box home improvement store near the beginning, and destroyed a 3-story wooden apartment building near the end of its track. When it hit us, it was at the EF0 to EF1 range, I believe the NWS said later. There were so many trees down, light poles at 45 degrees, other damage, and our town was very lucky overall. But I'll never forget the color of the green light, and the bathroom fan going full blast with no power on. I was in my first semester of university. I had just graduated college not too long ago, and had entered into a program that after a while I would come to resent. During that time, with adjusting and taking daily transit an hour and a half away from where I grew up into the big city in order to study was somewhat of a new adventure to me. In a lot of ways, I was just beginning to sprout as my own individual and trying to carve a path of my life when simultaneously opening up myself to new experiences and a new environment. I have longtime friends who go to the same facility as me, but all the time our schedules wouldn't always line up. This meant that a lot of my days were spent traveling back and forth and walking around the city alone. I really wanted to try and expand my horizon of experiences and friends during this period. In a lot of ways, I was really desiring to find a good community on campus that could help me satiate my boredom and loneliness. I can be extremely extroverted, but sometimes I find it takes a lot of me to try and actually pursue and maintain friendships that I haven't been established years prior. I've made friends before from different classes in college, but ultimately, and I know this makes me an asshole, but I would end up texting them less and less until eventually either side would end up ghosting one or the other. Because I'm a busy guy, I don't find myself prioritizing people who I feel like aren't as important to me as others. I know, a shitty thing to say, but nonetheless the truth. One day, however, I met Joel. I was on the phone with my fiancé, and I distinctly remember exactly how it all went down. As I was walking out of the school's Starbucks with a decaf coffee, I had one headphone in, and I was heading to class through a small stretch of underground passageway under the street that connects the school's library building to the actual building that possesses classes. As I was hastily making my way, I saw this short and stout guy, looking roughly my age at the time, which was 21. He had a thick brown beard and a hat on. Our eyes met, and as I was about to simply walk past, he asked me something in a very charismatic and calm tone. "Hey, sorry to bother you. You look like a pretty busy guy, but I was wondering, do you mind doing a survey about religion? It's for one of my classes." To this, I regret answering and wish I had simply continued walking, but at the time, I was becoming more and more compelled by the notion of formal religious institutions and questioning my own religious faith, particularly leaning towards Christianity. "Sure," I replied. He then introduced himself as Joel, and after we went through a small survey pertaining to religious affiliations and perspectives on religions, Joel informed me that a small group of students like himself were planning on getting together as a group and discussing various religions in order to gather new insights and to create a community. Of course, with the prospect of finding some new friends on campus and also exploring my own spiritual perspectives, I gave him my phone number after he asked for it. He said that he would contact me in the next following days. Upon entering our first meeting, I sat down in a very crowded place with seats at our school facility and was greeted by Joel, alongside a bunch of other members. They introduced themselves to me and vice versa, and they were all extremely kind to me. We began our small group meeting, and I was a bit shocked to find out that the sole topic that they were going to discuss was Christianity. I wasn't aware that we were only going to be discussing Christianity, which is against what he had initially proposed this group to constitute upon our meeting in the tunnel. That being said, I was still curious enough to continue, and I was accompanied by 3 other young guys of my age, who after a bit of talking with, I found out we had a lot of similar interests. Joel, who now presented himself as the leader of our study group, relayed how we would be analyzing Christianity through a multi-step program designed to unveil the holy power associated with the religion to us. Since I was curious and wanted to learn more about the religion as well as having made some newfound friends, I continued to attend this, quote, study group for the rest of the semester, in which there were a few circumstances where I questioned Joel's interpretations and was met with hard resistance. It felt like at times my wavering belief in what Joel was saying would be met with straight dismissal as opposed to actual conversation. I continued to brush that off as the group that I was working with got closer. The school's club, which I was now an official part of, provided me with exactly what I had wanted. We even went to a church-run event together where I quit vaping and many individuals reported mystical experiences. Things only started to get concerning with Joel during one of our one-on-one conversations. I discussed my personal experiences and belief in my newfound religious beliefs, and all of my former spiritual experiences as well, and Joel exposed me to a story and a few incidents that at the time I certainly should have taken as red flags. For example, when he was younger, he had gone on a retreat where when he was in prayer, he said that he began to hear the voice of God talk to him. I questioned at first if he was referring to the voice of God as more of a metaphor, but he reassured me that he literally heard God speak to him before. When he told me this, I became a bit unnerved. At the helm of this community was Joel, but in all other senses I was satisfied with who I was and what we were doing together. Though I'm not entirely dismissive of strange occurrences, especially pertaining to spirituality, his experience of talking with God in his head came off as uncomfortable to me. He also said that the way that he would pray would involve a direct conversation and reply with God. Out of discomfort, I wouldn't prod him on what that really meant. This, of course, was just the beginning. After the summer had ended, I found myself in the most religiously devoted state I had ever been in. Throughout the summer, I had had a treacherous injury which left me housebound for months and to call upon God in a lot of ways for strength. With my newfound devotion, I was elated to fall back into the community that I had nurtured and grown with throughout the last semester, relating to something that I had found deep joy in. At the first lesson of the semester, something was very different. Joel, as before, was at the helm of our study session, but was now perpetually interrupted by people coming to greet him and give him praise. It was so bad that we literally essentially sat and watched for 20 minutes before we can get on with our lesson, as more than 10 people, mostly young men of our age, came to greet this man. As aforementioned, when not unnerving, he was extremely charming and gave the impression that he cared deeply for everyone. Once our lesson began, he introduced us to the second phase of the program. He explained to us that this was one of the toughest programs of the different levels that there were, as it required even more devotion and, more importantly, an emphasis on sacrifice for those who engaged. He showed us a diagram of a small stick person, and he showed that in this program we would have to accept Jesus as the center of our life. He explained that by making our lives surround Jesus entirely, that we would not be losing something, but be gaining it. He also began to go over the notion that sex before marriage is a sin, and that if we were to continue with this program, we would have to make the sacrifice of giving up sex in our relationships and prove that we weren't. He said that many guys weren't able to continue because of it. I talked about this afterwards with one of the members of the group, who, not unlike me, had been in a serious relationship with someone they loved for years. In my personal opinion, though we weren't married on the altar, I knew that both me and this other member felt devoted to our partners as if we were already married in a sense, and we both expressed how Joel's behavior surrounding this was off-putting, controlling, and intrusive. After our lesson, I was a bit dumbfounded by the intensity of which he gave his speech about the new program that we would be engaging in this semester. Joel and I sat down for a few more minutes and talked, in which I expressed experiences of devotion from the summer and explained my entire catastrophic experience with my injury. He then went on to tell me that at times, he was actually able to know things beforehand. This seemingly random and strange statement shocked me. He said, for example, he was able to know something another member had before they even mentioned it, and in the way that he described it, it sounded like he was saying he had some form of mystical foresight. I was a bit jarred to say the least, though. I felt like it would be impolite to question any further. Joel then went on to tell me that he believed that I, if successfully completed this program, was primed to become a teacher for the first program I had done the semester prior, leading others who would join, and that I had a bright future in the organization. In that moment, with what he had laid down on us in that last lesson, I felt very overwhelmed by his expectations of me. It also became very evident that Joel was not a student at our facility. In fact, he was in his mid-30s and had kids. He was actually just a part of an organization that recruits people to become Christians and missionaries that work on our campus. This means that he actually lied to me when I first met him. He wasn't a student. There was no group talking about various religions, and his whole purpose was to convert me to make me join the organization he was a part of. At this point, school began to pick up a lot, and I was working part-time to help support myself. As I was on the train to head back home the next week, I had forgotten that my second lesson of the program that semester was supposed to happen, so I texted Joel saying, "Hey man, I actually got onto the train and forgot about our lesson. Sorry about that, dude. I'm not going to be able to make it. I also have work later." To which he replied, "Can you get off the train? Try and get here as soon as possible." I was a bit dumbfounded at this question. Since I live an hour and a half away, it wasn't as easy as getting off the train and heading back the opposite direction, and he knew that. He knew that the area that I lived in was remote and a long distance away. I also told him that I had work, which he had plainly disregarded. "No man, unfortunately I can't come. Have a good lesson," I replied, to which he again said, "Come on man, just get off the train and come back." At this point I was annoyed. Not only did I feel like he was commanding me, but that he was also blatantly disregarding the fact that I said no and that I had work that day. I didn't answer him. I talked with my fiancé about how I was starting to feel about the whole ordeal, and how I felt guilty about having feelings of wanting to distance myself from the group, while simultaneously not wanting to lose the community and friends that I had established along the way. My fiancé told me that by the way that Joel was acting, and with regards to the things that he was saying, she was starting to become uncomfortable with the whole situation. I remember sitting in bed thinking about leaving the group, and how the prospect made me feel physically ill. After all, I had been given everything I wanted in the community, except at the helm, which was from a person that was seemingly increasingly controlling and persuasive, and was making me and possibly other members feel more miserable. There was an event the following Friday that was going to be at the church, which was organized by the community. Originally, since many of my friends from the group were going, I intended to go, but alas, I was scheduled by my boss to work that day, so there was no way I was going to be able to attend. I knew that Joel would be insistent upon me coming anyway, so when Joel texted me reminding me that the event was Friday, I told him that I wasn't going to be able to go because I had work. To this he replied and simply said, "What? Bro, no way, you've gotta come. Take work off and find somebody to take your shift. God wants you here." I was expected. He dismissed my decision and also said that I had to be there because God wanted me there, as if he was his mouthpiece. I went on to text him again and inform him, "No, sorry man, I can't do that. I just got a promotion and I have to be there. I hope you guys have a great time anyway." To which he then again replied similarly to what he had before. This was my personal breaking point. He knew the importance of my financial situation, and his dismissal of my personal boundaries, as well as his commanding, made me decide to text him explaining that I was done with the group and that I wanted to pursue my own religious exploration without the group from then on. I felt as if he slowly but surely increasingly controlled me and was trying to take what he could, commanding me as if he was the leader of my life in any way possible. It was even up to him if I could fuck my fiancée or not. He replied with a long paragraph persisting in this sort of overly kind manner that I had to continue with the group and that it was God's will for me to show up to the event even though I was completely unable to. He was certain that this group was meant for me and that God had told him that this was where I was supposed to be. After I responded again telling him to stop and that I would not, he sent me another paragraph of similar length repeating what he would say. No matter what I would say and whenever I would say no, he would overstep my boundaries while maintaining a kind and friendly tone in order to try and push me into submission when I clearly said no. At this point I said I did not want him to talk to me anymore, to which he replied, "Bro, why? Can we meet up? I want you to explain why you don't want to continue, so can we meet up and do that? I can get a better sense and we can try to figure out what we do from here." Even in this, I knew he was trying to elongate his chance at bringing me back into the group and continuing his reign of control. I said I didn't want to, so he asked again. I decided at that moment that I needed to block him, so I did. A semester later, I was walking down the street of my school, and as I walked by a pizza parlor, lo and behold, who came out? Joel walked over to me with one of his friends and said that I was one of his friends to his buddy. I uncomfortably stood there, and his friend went inside for a moment while Joel turned around to look at me and asked with his disarming gentleness, "Did you block me?" I replied yes. He then said, "You should unblock me. That way we can meet up and talk because I really want to know why you left the group." To which I was evidently frustrated, said okay, and went on my way. That night he texted me on my Instagram insisting we meet up again, and I blocked him there too. In short, I'm thankful for my fiancée who is the love of my life. Without her, I'm not sure I would have been strong enough to leave the group and his control. The fact of the matter is that there were other guys in the group who had absolutely nobody. They had nothing, and they were prime targets for this charismatic and controlling freak. There were members of that group who were in higher levels, so to speak, who had done all the programs and who seemed as if they were emaciated. But they had become such restricted fundamentalists that their lives and their openness to new experiences were significantly thwarted. Beware of who you let into your life, and just because somebody is nice to you doesn't mean that they might not have ulterior motives. Also, learn to stand your ground and respect yourself. If you say no, mean it. So Joel, you controlling cult leader, let's not meet again. I hadn't had any major incidents while traveling, but it finally caught up with me this April. My husband and I were in Cape Town and went to Our Bay to do a snorkeling with seals thing. It wrapped up by midday, so we decided to go check out a farmer's market that was only a 10-minute walk away. It was a pretty touristy area, broad daylight around noon, and a short walk. It seemed like no big deal. We started walking towards the market and approached the start of an S-curve in the road. We see people walking past us in the opposite direction and cars driving by. We get to the middle of the S-curve, so the area we came from is now hidden from us, as is the area we are heading to. It was a blind spot, so to speak. All of a sudden, we just noticed these two guys walk past us, again. They had passed us just a couple minutes earlier, going the other way. We remembered them since one of the guys had a bright orange shirt on. Next thing I know, this orange shirt guy is walking towards me with a wooden pole raised threateningly. He doesn't say a word and starts hitting me. There's literally no one else around at this point, nor any cars driving by. The next few minutes are a blur. I just remember yelling no and screaming for help and somehow ending up on the ground trying to kick this guy away. After what feels like forever, a community patrol drives around the corner. He's basically a local neighborhood watch guy. He sees what's happening and pulls up and gets out of the car, which causes the two guys to bolt. We end up being taken to a fire department by our savior, who then patch us up a little bit before getting taken to the police by an ambulance to file a report. My husband had to get some stitches on his elbow from blocking some blows, and we both had a ton of bruises, but luckily no broken bones or anything else major. It still feels so surreal now. It's a I can't believe that actually happened to me kind of moment. We thought we're always aware of our surroundings, but we let our guards down that day and got really unlucky that no one else was walking when we were. It just taught us that these things can happen to anyone at any time, not just when it's dark out. Always be aware of your surroundings, especially in a place that has a reputation for violent crime. I wasn't actually there when the incident happened, but I can tell you what my parents told me years later. When I was about 6 years old, we had just moved into our then new house. When I think back on it, I would say that we moved into a relatively safe neighborhood compared to where we were before. Neighborhood security, better fencing, all that good stuff. Anyway, my dad had just come back home from dropping me off at school for the day. He pulled into the garage from the back alley, only to find that the garage door was wide open. His initial thought was that he had forgotten to close it when he had left with me earlier. However, he then noticed that the car parked in the driveway outside of the garage had its front passenger door wide open. Just then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a man that was peeking around from inside the garage near the laundry room. This was the only room that connects to the main part of the house. My dad doesn't think that they have noticed his car yet, and without finishing pulling in, he jumped out of the car and started towards the laundry room. At this point, though, the intruder must have seen him, as he quickly turned around and started through the house. Meanwhile, my mother was working from home that day and was tapping away on her laptop in a different room in the house. She had heard the garage door open a couple of minutes ago, thinking it was just my dad returning home from dropping me off, so she didn't really think much of it. After a minute or so, she did call out to my dad to get his attention, but he didn't respond. As she finished up what she was doing with her work laptop, she stood up, only to see two big men wearing ski masks bolt past her from the main part of the house. Her immediate reaction was to scream, "Who are you people?" To which the two intruders turned to face her directly. She didn't really get a good look at them, not just because they were wearing ski masks, but because she was so frightened and that she started screaming at them. Out of adrenaline, she then began charging at them with nothing for defense except her body. I guess this, mixed with the fact that they had realized someone else was coming in from the garage, spooked them enough to force open the front door nearby where they were, and then they sprinted down the street. However, this did not stop my mother, who took off after them down the street, yelling and screaming profanities at them. My father eventually caught up with her and calmed her down, but they didn't catch the two intruders in the end. They filed a police report, and both my father and her father had a stern talking to with my mom. I mean, I really don't blame them though. I understand that she wanted to defend her new home, but who knows what would have happened if they had weapons of their own, or even if they hadn't noticed my dad come inside behind them. Plus, they were clearly bigger and probably stronger than her too. Even so, to this day, I know that my mom would still try to defend the house, and us, if there was any intruders trying to break in. I love you, Mom.